Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Congressman. Thanks so much for being here. My name's Tanzina Vega. I'm your national race and inequality reporter with CNN Money. And today we're going to talk a little bit about, well, we're in the middle of a pretty contentious election cycle. We are about to elect the next president of the United States. Coming up January 2017, what are some of the things that Congress and this new administration, whoever it is, can begin to tackle day one?
Well, thank you, Tanzina, and to everyone here, greatly appreciate your commitment to this cause. I want to thank Rob Gordon, somebody who I served with in the United States Army, and I appreciate Alan's leadership as well. And this question, I think, is really central to us, a nation that's really looking to leadership to bring us together. And I would say that you look at tax reform, something that our nation did in the 1980s in a period of divided government. When we had a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, they came together to fix a broken code. And it really ended up helping throughout the late 80s and the 90s to having opportunity. And during that period, we actually saw wages rising. And that's part of the problem we're having today is really wages have been stagnant for about 20 years. So I think that the climate is really ripe to do this again, to work together. Likely we'll be in an era of divided government again, that we would come together and we would do this. And I think it would not only grow the economy, provide more opportunity, but there's also a real potential that we can tie in infrastructure with this. Just passed a very important 5-year robust bill, but candidly, even the investments that we're making on the federal level are not enough. We need much more involvement in the private sector in our infrastructure revitalization. So I think through this tax reform, we can get that done. And I think that will help. As I look at some of the goals of Opportunity Nation, I think that this is something right from the start in the first year that we can actually enact that I think will help achieve some of the goals of Opportunity Nation.
And we were talking backstage a little bit about the climate right now. A lot of Americans are really frustrated with government. They're frustrated with what they think is just the inability for our government to get things done. And a lot of that is because they see it as a very partisan government. We're here talking today a lot about bipartisanship. What are some of the keys to bipartisanship, especially in this very divided era that we're in right now?
Well, thank you for that question. It is very important. And the first thing is, I would tell you, is I'm a co-chair of a group, an organization called No Labels. And No Labels really is dedicated to the proposition that first thing is you don't have to give up your principles. Whether you be liberal or conservative, you can hold your principles, but we have a responsibility to govern, which means we need to seek out that common ground and to be able to, when we find it, legislate that enacts new law that helps all people. So, I would say that to address the underlying question, I think it's important to reflect on the founding of our nation because it truly was exceptional, and we have a tendency to take it for granted that we came forward with a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and really put the individual at the center. Heretofore, it was always the state, and we had monarchy, king and queen, aristocracy, and we said we could govern ourselves. As part of that, we set up a form of government that in the absence of consensus, we keep the status quo. We did that to protect our liberty. We still have that system. And if you believe, as I do, that the status quo is unacceptable, that in an era of divided government, by very definition, you're going to work together. You have to, because if you don't work together, you keep the status quo. So I think this is what's really driving a lot of us that are in No Labels. And candidly, we have achieved some very important legislation, and we have to work harder to communicate that. Actually, new laws, legislation in the 114th Congress is up 20% from the 113th Congress, and it's not widely known. Landmark legislation with regard to infrastructure, I mentioned that. Education, we actually rolled back No Child Left Behind, and we empowered more localities. A series, we actually enacted very important reform for veterans, the Clay Hunt Suicide Awareness and Prevention Bill. I was a part author of that. So look, we've got much more to do. But as I was mentioning backstage, I think that of all the challenges we have, and to be sure, we have challenges, to me, I think what's most important is that we keep faith in our ability to be self-governing, that what we started over 200 years ago is still not only possible, but really holds the best promise. And to do that for mankind, and to do that, though, we have to commit ourselves to constantly seeking not only common ground, but that we don't give up. As frustrated as we may be, and I know there's a high level of frustration, that we never give up on ourselves, that we can do this.
You've served over 2 decades in the military, including tours in the first Gulf War, in Kosovo, and in Iraq. Is the military still a vehicle for opportunity? Often you see poor and working class Americans, black and brown Americans, going into the military because that's the one opportunity they have. Is that still the same today?
Absolutely, and there's no doubt about this. You know, I came from a working class family. Our family was proud of that. Laborers, no one in my family had ever gone to college. I was the first one. I actually started as an enlisted man. I was a private and enlisted at the age of 17 and made the transition to officer at ROTC. But, you know, I will tell you that absolutely, this promise of American life is seen within the institution of the military. In fact, in the Army, there was really only one color, and that was green. We all wore the same Army green, and we were dedicated to protecting this exceptional way of life. And whether it be General Powell or my Sergeant Major I served with, Richard Flowers, who came from New York City and rose to the highest rank in the enlisted ranks, you know, the examples there are clear and shining, and we see this for women as well. We now have women 4-star level commanders. You know, the idea of opportunity nation, that when you reach back to the Declaration of Independence, that, you know, that all of us are created equal. You know, this is seen through the military, but it's also inspiration, I think, for all of us, that we're constantly trying to perfect our union. That ideal that was brought forward to us, we know we haven't reached it, but we're constantly striving for it. I'm reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King, you know, when he came to Washington, D.C., and he said, you know, I'm here to cash a check. You know, the promissory note that came with the Declaration of Independence, that he was such a strong patriot, that he believed in us, and he really hearkened us to reach those ideals. And I think that's what we need right now. We need faith that we can do this, and we need leadership that brings us together.
You mentioned you grew up in a working class family. That's one of the things I think you and I both have in common, going to college and having this sort of background. A lot of people in those communities today are feeling like they're cut off from opportunity, right? That they don't have the same opportunities that maybe were existing 30 years ago. Yeah. What would you say is the one thing that you would tell people who are in the working class right now, who are in the lower middle class, who are trying to access some of this opportunity?
Well, you know, the first thing is I think it's important to start with a realistic assessment. And as much as I'm an optimist, I'm clearly an optimist. Glass is always 5/6 full. We got to recognize that wages really haven't been rising in 20 years plus. So I wouldn't want to speak to a reality that isn't grounded. But at the same time, that while we have significant challenges, we have it within us that we can change matters. We absolutely can do this. That with the right leadership that provides focus, that with public policy that changes, that helps with better education, and was mentioned earlier today, not only in secondary education, but in higher education. You know, there's so much more reform that I believe that we can enact together. And then with infrastructure that helps. A world-class economy needs a world-class infrastructure that can be facilitating. That we have this possibility that the 21st century will be our best century yet.
There are going to be 3 senators receiving an award today for being able to work across the aisle. Why is that important, and what suggestions do you have for new members of Congress elected in November to do that?
Well, you know, this is a very important question because you mentioned this is an angsting time. In part, this is driven by, you know, so many Americans who don't feel that the American dream is possible, but also there's some, we see a proliferation of social media, of cable TV, and it's really driven our politics to the extremes, to the polar. And you know, I think it's important to recognize that in groups such as No Labels, you don't have to give up your principles. Oh no, you can celebrate. In fact, we're a nation, we're proud of the fact that we have diversity of thought, diversity of action. We're proud of that. But at the same time, we have to bring a functionality. And I think that's why it's important to have a historical perspective, that in the absence of consensus, we keep the status quo. And sometimes when I do town hall meetings, and in town hall meetings, there's a self-selection bias. You'll get the strongest right wing, the strongest left wing, and the one thing I'll say to them, because they're ready to go at each other, is say, well, let me ask you this. Are you satisfied with where we are today? Well, they all agree no. Well, if we all agree no, then can we acknowledge that in an era of divided government, at a time that we all know we need to do better, in a governmental system that says in the absence of consensus you keep the status quo, can we agree that we have to work together or we end up keeping what we have? And when I get the folks to get committed in that way, that's the first step. And that's, I think, the answer to your question, is any new member that comes to Congress that really wants to make a difference, and likely what will be still divided government, a recognition that we have to find common ground.
Do you feel like you're alone in that sentiment,
No.
sort of preaching that?
No, I don't.
No?
I don't feel alone at all. In fact, I not only never feel alone, I'm strong in my faith as well, but I still believe in us as a people. I mean this. I mean, I really believe that this is possible for us, and that sometimes when people run down Congress, Congress is us. Congress is really, I came from the working class. I self-imposed term limits. This is my last term in the Congress. This will be 6 years in the Congress, but it was never about me. It was always about my service to others, and I think we have to have a mindset change. And I think that's what's really important to our leaders, is a sense of service. Quite frankly, it's one of the reasons why I'm trying to get more veterans in Congress. And here's why. Regardless of their ideology, if they have one, or even their partisan affiliation, veterans share two things. One is a mission focus to get things done, and the second is a service orientation to serve others. And I think if we keep that front and center, we will tackle any problem. We've been in tougher situations, and I know that we're in a tough situation now. We've been in tougher, but we've always tackled it.
What are your plans for January 2017?
Well, thank you. As I finish my time in the United States Congress, I'm very excited to rejoin the classroom. I was an infantryman, started as a private. I rose to colonel in brigade command in the 82nd Airborne Division, but the Army actually had me teach 3 years. That's how I met Rob Gordon. We taught together at the United States Military Academy at West Point. I've accepted a position at Williams College. I'm going to teach leadership in American foreign policy, and I look forward to writing again, too. My first book was a textbook. I hope to write perhaps more for a wider audience about a lot of what we talked about today. And at the same time, with 3 teenagers, my wife and I, it's very important that I spend time. We'll never get these 3 years back. Our youngest is 15. So I'm going to go from working about 90 hours a week to about 45. I think I can get a lot of good work done in 45 hours a week. But I'm going to be able to reinvest that time into my family. I think that's important, too.
Excellent. Congressman, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim.